Welcome, everyone. I think there's still quite a few people joining, but I think we can kick off with the welcome and introductions. First of all, thank you very much for joining us for our fourth I Am a Founder webinar. And today we're going to be talking about working remotely with distributed teams. But I think it's a lot going to be delving into how to really reach higher levels of working from home rather than just Zoom webinars and Zoom calls, which we're all, I think, we've mastered and probably getting up to about here with at the moment. I'm first of all, I guess, well, what a week it's been. The opening of the furloughing portal, where the government will pay salaries for employees for 4 months at the moment. And then a number of you would have noticed that the future fund, whereby the government is taking convertible loan note instruments in startups and scale-ups, especially in the tech and science sectors. So been a busy week for many of you, I know. Today, I'm delighted that we're joined by Joe Pelissier. Joe is a communications expert, and many of you will subscribe to our I'm a Founder newsletters and receive other communications. And Joe works with us as well as some big brands such as Nespresso, Gucci, and the RFU. And Joe and Emanuele have been pivotal in creating those communications. Joe, maybe you can like to introduce yourself a little bit more.
Well, thanks, Adam. I think it's all been a sort of lot of teamwork, and it's been quite a good example in terms of remote working, how everybody's actually adapted to it. Yes, I mean, I do three things mainly. I sort of do, I advise businesses on their communication strategy, but also on their tone of voice. I deliver a lot of training to do with that. And because I've been in media communications a long time, I also work in helping brands with their brand identity. And then because my background was originally in the film industry, I still keep my hand in with films and make a lot of training videos. But I suppose what I'm really interested in, and it's why I'm doing some more work on remote working, is how brands develop relationships through spoken, written, and visual communication. And I think at the moment what happens, we get a little bit hung up on all the technologies that are there, as opposed to actually thinking about what is the message we want to communicate and what is the best way of doing it. So remote working is very important at the moment.
Thank you, Joe. I think before we go into just two things, we've got a poll, which I'd be grateful if you could answer. How have you and your team taken to remote working? And there's three available options there, which would be grateful if you could complete, and we'll talk about some of those results in a moment. This is it's meant as a conversational or discursive style. So if you do have any questions, either put your hand up and we'll come to you, and you can ask Joe your question, or please type in the Q&A, and there's an option if you want to do it anonymously. That's totally fine. If you're happy, please leave your name in there, but do send us questions, and we'll do our best to answer them within the half an hour, 45 minutes that we've allocated. Joe, perhaps we could kick off, or I could kick off with a question for you. What are your observations working with, I guess, some big and small organizations with regards to remote working since really the lockdown commenced?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And I think for me, there have been three things. I think that the first is that haven't been really prepared for this. The second is to do with time integrity. I'll explain a little bit more about that. And the third is the fact that we're not really sort of the challenge of keeping everybody focused and motivated as a remote team. Now, the first one's quite revealing, because I've just got some notes here. I know that in terms of our readiness, Bill Gates gave a talk in 2015, and he said the next outbreak, we're not ready. And he's been going on about this for quite a long time. But then there's also more interesting report. I'm afraid I haven't read these. It's a research I picked up elsewhere, but it's got the catchy title of the Global Preparedness Mentoring Monitoring Board. But this is very significant because in October, they published something calling for better preparation for managing the fallout of a high impact respiratory pathogen. So it's almost as if people in the know knew it was coming, but a lot of businesses or organizations didn't pay attention to it. But then this also links into a friend of mine called Jeremy Blaine did some research into digital transformation and how ready we are for this. And this was a report that was done in February of last year, and it had about 1,200 respondents. So it was a good data came out of it. But what that showed is that 50% of leaders weren't really ready for digital transformation, or in terms of thinking about what it was to be a digital business. But even more significantly, the ones that were in a readiness, better readiness, tend to be from the Far East, in particular Singapore. And that I was interested in it because that overlapped with my own work with Sony last year, who were saying, well, we're a digital organization, but how digital are we? And so I think we've all been, a lot of businesses have been caught short by this, because up until when the pandemic started, apparently only 44% of businesses had experienced remote working. So obviously now it's got to be up to about 80, 90% of it. So that's a big change.
I have to admit, within our own business, so most of the people on this call will know Ignition Financial. We operate flexible working, and about half of our team are work from home primarily before the outbreak, and so there's been for them it's not been as difficult to transition work-wise. I'm talking about as it has for our office-based team, and I have to admit, I know the poll has just flashed up. Most people seem to be saying we've coped better than I imagined, which is very positive. I think me personally, I would put it in the with difficulty category, even though we've got a lot of flexible working experience in our team, and I did work 1 day a week from home to start with. Certainly I know there are a number of people who are working till 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock. I've had a number of nights like that. Wednesday, I mean, you can see this chair here. This chair here is for comfort, because on Wednesday I was on Zoom calls and webinars for, I think, all but half an hour from between 1:45 and 8 p.m.
I mean, and I think that links into my second observation, which is about time integrity.
Yeah.
But I also quite like the fact on this statistic that 33% have taken it to like a duck to water. But this group is probably atypical, because if you've got entrepreneurs and founders, they're going to be quite open to new ways of working. But the problems that you're talking about are to do with this time integrity, and that's to do when managers actually have their own time constraints and they impose that on somebody else about when that's going to be done. And it's to do with synchronous thinking, 9-to-5 thinking, as opposed to asynchronous thinking, when you're more flexible in terms of how people work, which is why we've, in terms of a survey that I'm working on, we're going to do a white paper on it. People are saying, well, I'm just working 24/7. I don't even have time for lunch. And I think what this then raises the issue in terms of you as a manager and a leader, what you actually expect from your team. And I think you're probably being fairly modest, because I've been working quite closely with all of you. And it's what I've seen as well with big businesses as well as small ones, is that the ones that have a very good company culture, a set of values that they work with, they've been able to manage the transfer much better than those who don't. My daughter actually works for a company in Milan, and they really didn't want to do any remote working at all, and did it very, very late. And they've not been very good at it. And the result, they have a very fragmented and very discontented workforce. And you're not in that position. I would be interested to know what other people on the call think. So I go, the third one is actually to do with keeping everyone focused and motivated. And I think that's important, because we have to remember, even though we're talking about remote working, it's not real remote working, it's enforced remote working, because so many people have young families. Fortunately, my children are grown up now, but I know you've got young kids. And if you're working with young children, trying to get that balance between doing your work, looking after them, and schooling them, kind of skews everything at the moment. And we almost have to put that to one side, but this actually links back to managers not necessarily being cognizant of the fact that they're asking people to do things who are operating in a very stressful environment. And that's why you're saying you're up till 11 o'clock at night, and lots of people are doing that.
We've had, I think it's more of a comment from Rachel in the chat box, who said, I think working remotely and being at home trying to work in the middle of a crisis are two different things. I mean, Rachel, was there, is there something that you'd like to discuss on this particular topic, or is it more of a statement that you'd like to that you liking Joe to or I to comment on?
I think Rachel's right, as I think people are working in a crisis. But I think what's interesting in terms of how we actually perceived it at the very beginning was the lockdown started on the 23rd of March. Everybody just, and you and I had this, everybody was action stations trying to do things.
Yeah.
And then they were managing things in a crisis. But you talk to businesses now, and they seem to have got some processes. And when we talk about the 5 levels of remote working, we'll see how that works. They're starting to see, well, that doesn't work well, that works well. Well, maybe we should go on to that now, I don't know.
Okay. We've got a slide flash up at the moment on the 5 levels of remote working. Joe, and there's an arrow with with a spot of office replication.
That should say you are here, which is where most people are. I mean, this is actually quite a useful model, and I stumbled across it by chance. And it's not my invention at all. It's from somebody called Matt Mullenweg, and he is the founder of a company called Automatic, which drives WordPress and so around 30% of the world's websites. And he conceived his business to be a completely distributed workforce. Mm-hmm. He's got 1,200 employees working across 75 different countries. And so I came across this, and then I listened to the sort of podcast interview with a guy called Tim Harris. And what's interesting about it, well, it obviously takes you through the phases, but it's also the idea, I think remote working is a really bad word, and we're stuck with using it in the UK. The Italians, interestingly, use smart working. And I think this is a much better way of thinking about it, because how can we actually work smarter? Because if you're talking about remote working, it's got all sorts of negative connotations. I'm locked away. I'm not necessarily valued. And a lot of people didn't value remote working until now. But what happens on level 1, you're really in denial. You're rather like the business my daughter works for, that you do not actually want to admit that it can happen. And you may be thinking, well, it actually won't work for our business. Our business we've got a different model.
Yeah. And
lots of larger organizations, particularly those with sort of big properties, a big presence in London and other cities, don't like this idea. And they actually their mindset looks down on people who work remotely as their outliers or teleworkers. But then what happens is we're now at level 2, there's office replication. So everybody had to do a massive offload and set everything up. But what happens then is you just start to repeat the things that you're comfortable with doing in your office, which is why everybody has their meetings and everybody operates in the same way. And you don't necessarily adapt to it. And I think the biggest challenge, again, I keep going back to the managers, was I think this is important, is managers are there to manage people and set up lots of meetings, because that actually gives them control. It makes them feel good about themselves. They're the power base. But what we're finding is that from the research is that's actually not necessarily delivering the best results. And so very quickly you start to take advantage of remote working by saying, well, that works well that way, that doesn't work well that way. Why don't we try and explore something else? So rather, I'd never heard of this, but sort of Matt Mullenweg, I find his name very difficult to pronounce, was talking about it, is that on using Google Docs, when you have a meeting, one person takes the meeting in real time and the others can see those meeting notes. And so you don't literally have the meeting and say, well, Adam, can you write the notes up and distribute them around afterwards? It's all done on real time. So in effect, people are actually on the same page. And then you go up to asynchronously productive, where you're not thinking 9 to 5. You're taking advantage of the fact that people have children, or they prefer their larks or night owls, or that they can work in different countries. And then it starts to liberate you completely from how you
Mm.
think about it. And it has a very big impact, I think, going forward on how we actually recruit people. Because we were, Adam, you and I on a call the other day, and one of the people on that was talking about how the organization he worked was thinking very differently about women in the workplace who'd actually highly skilled, stopped work, were looking after their kids for a bit, but actually they could actually do an awful lot now because we could prove how we could work with them asynchronously. And then finally, you get to nirvana. And I think the way Manu rather funnily marketed this, it's almost as if we've got to be taking illegal substances or lots of alcohol to get to that stage. And maybe we all have been at the moment over the past few weeks. But kind of when you get there, you know how it's working. And I suppose you have a business like Automatic, and there are lots of them around that are using remote work in the right way. And I think what the lessons that come out of this actually are from the tech industry. The tech industry knows how to do this. And so I think this is why sometimes people in more traditional businesses haven't wanted to follow their lead, because they say, well, we're not a techie business, that's what they do. But we know that we do have to learn from them now. Where are you in this, do you think, now?
As we were definitely at the office replication stage, led by I'll hold my hands up and say I was asking for a lot of Zoom meetings and calls with colleagues, but I think we're taking advantage, and I hope moving asynchronously productive. Um, we we do have, I think almost everyone in our team has has children, and so being flexible has always, in terms of the hours that people work, has always been really, really important. But even more so now. So if people are offline for between 9:30 and 11:30 because they're doing some homeschooling, then that's fine. It's about people do within our team doing what they can when works for them. And I don't think it's going to be possible to settle into a rhythm. I think it's just about being flexible and understanding, and really trying to just the odd phone call with people and just saying, how are you getting on? Is there something which is taking up a lot of your time, or stealing your time?
Yeah.
We've used the phrase of quite a lot.
Yeah, I think that the other big thing is, and we can probably go on to the next slide that I've noticed, is really about how communication has changed. Because you've been talking a lot about Zoom meetings, and Zoom is, if you like, now the sort of the collective noun for a web collaboration meeting, even though there are lots of them out there, the sort of GoToMeeting and webcast and things like that, and Microsoft Teams. But what's interesting is if we start to think about how we actually communicate, actually going to work from the top down, and on the vertical, you can see frequency onto scarcity. And I got the percentages there. Don't worry about the percentages. I just put them randomly in terms of how you break up the work, because it will vary from organization to organization. But you could actually have right at the very top virtual reality. And that's starting to happen in some organizations where, let's say, Adam, you and I had a pair of goggles on, and we're having the same immersive experience as we're traveling around and experiencing something.
Yep.
But what's happened with video is being used far too much, whereas when it is used a little bit less sparingly, it becomes more effective. Because when there's been directives, I've seen it, where people have a Zoom meeting and the command is everybody's got to switch on their cameras. But what we know is when the camera is on, it makes people very self-conscious. You're suddenly inviting somebody into your home, which you haven't necessarily agreed to. And we don't always concentrate as well when the camera is on. And I know of one particular client of mine in Italy, well, it's actually Gucci, in fact, that they have no video meetings. And when they have their meetings, they're all voice meetings, because what they find is people listen and they concentrate much better. Now, that's not to say you don't have the camera switched on at some time, because sometimes for short team meetings or one-to-ones, they work well. But what also happens now is we're getting better at using chat and working out the balance between chat and email. I think the email is right at the bottom is the real problem,
Yeah,
because there is more email going on now. And I think I was reading some McKinsey research that says up to 30% of our day is spent reading and writing emails, and maybe 60% of the communication is emails. And so what we have to do in terms of this communication pyramid, we have to start, this is what I'm coming to the conclusion looking at things, rather than thinking about all the different tools that we have to use, we have to think about what is the most effective way of getting our message across. If it is email, what are the guidelines for doing this? And of
yeah,
course, one of the really important things that comes out of this is as an organization, you're really dependent on good written communication skills. And if those aren't very strong in your organization, then it starts to go a little bit wonky. The one on the right, which is where I got tasked 20%, this is where some organizations use tools like Trello or Jira to project manage tasks. And then there's a whole communication that goes on within that team. And so this is an interesting mix. And I think that going forward, it's going to be really important in the way from remote working, organizations think about the balance between how they use video, chat, voice, and email. And again, interesting things happening to do with sales teams, because how you communicate on sales when you traditionally can't go and see people. I'm finding people are now starting to get quite good at sending little WhatsApp audio messages, 30 seconds.
I think on that point, we've comment from Dave. Interestingly, our company has now mandated video on for all meetings. We've seen a big shift to chats in lieu of meetings now.
Yeah.
That's I think within our own organization, within Ignition, if someone turned their video off, it was normally because they're on Virgin broadband. But
but this is also to do with the office replication. Say, look,
yeah,
we'll have the meeting. Have the meeting. We'll switch the camera on. Then we can all see everybody. And it's also linked to managers' mindset, thinking, well, if I can't see you, how do I know if you're working?
mm,
And so it's more of a security thing that the manager likes to be able to see everybody, and
yeah,
it's also a lack of trust, because again, what happens with businesses who are very good at, let's call it smart working, there is this unwritten trust. And it's also, there's a very good paper, there's a venture capitalist you probably know called David Graham. Doesn't matter. But anyway, he talks about, in terms of work, managers' time and makers' time. And I also add doers' time,
mm,
because managers operate on an hourly basis and they go from meeting.
yeah,
But we know there are lots of people in organizations who are makers, and makers tend to need about at least a 2-hour block to do something. And you know this with Ben and Seema and people in your team. They need, to do deep work and concentration. And then there are other people who probably they work in little short 5 or 10-minute bursts. Those are the doers. And so what you have to think about is how those people organize their time in relation to you. And Graham came across this because he happened to be a programmer turned venture capitalist. And when he became venture capitalist, he started to impose his management thinking onto the makers who he was looking to invest in. So he changed the way that he worked in order to accommodate them on certain days of the week.
okay. Should we go to Rachel? Because I think Rachel's got a question. Stu, could we put Rachel on? Rachel's on mute. There we
Hi.
go. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Rachel Van Walsum. Hi, Adam. I just want to go back to this point about remote working being very different to being forced to stay at home, trying to work in the middle of a crisis. Because like Adam, I do a lot of remote working, as do my management team. So we're wholly set up for that. And this chimes in with what Joe, you were saying in your third point, really. I mean, it is actually very difficult, I think, to manage a group of 9 people who all have different working hours, to actually stay in some sort of communication that isn't just on the email. So that was one point. I mean, I had an experience recently. We have a team catch up where it's actually just a sort of check in on mental health more than anything else, to see how everyone's coping. And we do it on Zoom, and it is with video. And on Monday, one of my senior managers simply burst into tears, which actually was very important and very liberating for everyone. And so I don't think it's just about the trust that's required from the managers. I think less senior people also need to see the vulnerabilities that managers are dealing with. And also, I think they need comfort, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I know another sort of similar related story of a friend of mine. He's a managing director of a business, and he had to furlough 50 people recently. And he had a number of other sort of domestic things he was dealing with, basically that his wife's got an autoimmune condition and she was stuck out in Spain and couldn't get back. And his name's Harry, and he's Harry's so quite robust, he can do things. He said, you know, it's extraordinary. I've been doing all of this. I've been managing all these people. I've got dealing with sort of Claire, but my boss, who was the bursar at this institution, nobody's once asked me how I'm getting on with everything. And I think this is one of the things that came back in terms of some of the research I did, is that there's not enough necessarily saying, well, actually, I just want to talk to you, Rachel, nothing to be work, just how are you getting on? How are you managing with these things? What can we do? Because I think it was so hands-on to do things, crisis management, but people actually forgot a little bit to sort of think about the mental well-being of people.
I think it's very difficult when you are a founder, because I think also there's an expectation, especially if you're taking care of people, that you'll keep looking out for them. And there comes a point where you can't do any more. And actually no one turns around and says, I completely agree, Joe. It's very rare that someone will turn around and say, well, how are you going to carry on?
Yeah.
You know, and it ends up feeling like and it's slightly tied into the rights of employees, that we're in a position where we're always looking after the employee, that we have very little rights. And if you are a founder and you're not a part of a big corporation, you know, you end up being all things to all people and very little to yourself in the end. It's very dangerous, I find.
I mean, I think that is an important point. And I think because mental wellness has been very top of the agenda, and quite rightly over the past couple of years, it's almost as if, and rightly, everybody thinks a lot about the NHS and frontline workers and their care homes, but it's almost as if I get the impression people have forgotten about it within their own organizations. But that's just an observation. I've got no evidence to support that.
Well, it's a very odd situation, I think, as everyone tries to juggle with whatever they're juggling with at home, and then trying to fit in work around that, which has been the biggest shock to me, because like Adam, I've had endless nights of working to midnight, because actually I have 2 hours of quality time when everyone's in bed, which is actually not very good for my own health long term, especially when the day doesn't start any later the next morning. So I do think it's very different to the remote working I had before, which had a structure that suited me and also suited the home environment. But that's been completely eroded now.
Yeah, and I think it's almost, I was going to say the word, it's sort of phony remote working, like a phony war. It's not, because it is remote working in these times. But I think what's interesting is what we all learn from it and how we adapt to it, because maybe that's one of the other things we should look at in terms of the future. What does the future look like? Because if so many businesses were in denial about it, but we've actually proved the case that it is possible to work remotely, albeit in a crisis situation, how does that change how we communicate going forward, how we operate as a business? And I think it's also very influential in terms of how people are recruited, because if it's been proven that people can work remotely, your talent pool suddenly becomes very widespread, and this doesn't have to be focused just on London or Leeds or wherever your business is. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Adam.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's going to be a lot of SMEs who are going to question whether they do, in fact, need an office in London, whether that's where they should be primarily looking to recruit people from. There are brilliant people all over the UK, and I think accessing, well, all over the world, in fact, accessing those people and accommodating them, if you can get to that that asynchronous state of working, well, you could be a truly international organization with very little by way of premises overhead.
I've got
Sorry.
So I've actually got a very good example of this as a story. I've got some friends who live up in the Highlands, and they told me about an American lawyer who lives on the Isle of Skye, who works for a French company based in Paris. And every 2 weeks, he's obviously not doing it now, but he would get on the train from the Kyle of Lochouch, which is right up by Skye, across to Inverness. Then he would get the sleeper to St Pancras, and then he would get the Eurostar to Paris. And he would do that twice a week. And that is a really good example of a sort of remote working model where you've got people, and that's the American and Sky who works for the French bank.
We this is not, it's going off on a tangent a little bit, but when Ignition Law have a lawyer who's based in Verbier in Switzerland, and she does a lot of share options with us. So I remember speaking with one client, and I said, "Oh, I'll introduce you to X. She's based in Switzerland, so she, she loves her skiing and her hiking, which she does by day, and then she'll do share option work in the evening." And he turned around to me and says, "Sounds fine, apart from one thing, that does sound like the worst après ski I've ever heard." Which I thought was a good comment. Can we go to Dave Frost, please, Stu? Dave, how are you? On mute. Hi, Dave.
Hello, Adam. Sorry, mate, I was on mute again.
That's okay.
How you doing?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. I have to say it hasn't been a massive change in working practice for us lot, as you probably know. Although the company itself is struggling more than I would have expected. Admin has probably increased tenfold with duplicated status reports, daily updates, and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. So, Dave, you're working in a international business. I think there's about 10,000 people that are in your group across about 40 or 50 countries. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Probably a few less now. So,
but it's yeah. It's the administration and I guess there's the communication, well, the emails and the admin overhead, which is increased for you.
I think it's kind of what Joe was talking about a little while ago. It's the trust from the sort of leadership teams. Yeah, I think for my team, everything was fine. We're distributed. We've been working together for 9+ years. Yeah, we've sort of very self-contained unit, and we've adjusted to it really well, despite the fact that there's literally nothing else you can do at the moment. But yeah, so we talk every day from a mental health perspective, as well as how we're getting on with the work kind of stuff. But the rest of the company is really struggling with it. I've had feedback from other teams that are sort of all feeling slightly depressed about sort of like the management view of how they should be reporting in and stuff like that. It's been quite a difficult period for some of the guys there.
And I think the reason for that is lots of managers and organizations have got no terms of reference for it. So they're actually making it up as they go along, and they're seeing how it works. And I think, I mean, I don't necessarily have the answers to anybody, but I think that what will come out of this is the understanding of, I mean, I think leadership is one of the themes. Leadership and management is a really, really strong one in terms of how you, not just how you organize somebody's work, how you manage the communication with them, and the frequency of that. And I think the other one is to do with the wellness piece. And I think, you know, going back to my report about the challenge of keeping people focused and motivated, the motivation tends to dip when people aren't necessarily clear on what the objectives are, and that they don't feel that people are looking out for them. And I don't think that, as somebody else said, just switching the camera on and letting everybody see everybody, that's not necessarily the answer. And I think that if you into those situations, you have to move quite quickly at the moment if we're going to be in lockdown for another 2 weeks, maybe even more, and how to manage that. I think it actually raises this issue, which I'm interested in myself, about tone of voice and communication, because and again, to do with the frequency of all the different tools we use, because
We lost Joe.
I thought it might have been my Virgin broadband.
I'm on version. Joe, I think we've lost you for a moment. Okay, Dave, while you're on.
Am I back?
Oh yes, you're back in the room now.
Ish.
You might, maybe if you turn your video off for a moment, Joe. There we go.
Okay, I'm back now. Okay, this is real time. Where were we before we were so rudely interrupted?
I think you were picking up on Dave's last comment. I've actually lost the last few minutes, so I think just
No, don't worry. I think what's important is this goes back to the communication, how managers and leaders operate with people, and this overwhelmingness of meetings. One of the biggest problems with communication with organizations is that most managers and leaders do not tell the people they work with how they want to be communicated, how they want to be communicated by. And the example for that is that if you've got a strong email culture, you as a manager have almost, I'd say, a duty to say, look, I don't need to be CC'd on everything. You don't need to, that's very nice, ask me how my day was or how my weekend is. We can actually be very informal and you just get straight to the point. We don't need to write emails for this. We'll just use chat for this. And what happens is, and it's linked to this, it's actually about, as a leadership or managers, being very clear as to how you want people to communicate with you. Because, and particularly when you've got larger organizations growing, is younger people are maybe less so these days, but generally a lot more deferential to older people in terms of how they write, which is why the older, more experienced people need to say, look, this is how we want you to communicate. And I've seen this time and time again with organizations get completely killed by email. And then as soon as the managers, team leaders say, oh, why don't I tell them I don't want all of this? This is how I want people to write to me. We can do it. And it also raises the whole question of how you use emoticons, because, you know, I'm from a generation that doesn't necessarily use them, but all my kids do a lot. But I've heard really good stories where in cultures where they're actually encouraged, because rather than say, yes, that will be fine, thanks, they just send a thumbs up, and that's fine. And in fact, it all links to the productivity. And it also is connected to the fact that where we're working, and again, from the pressure from managers, I did one audit with one company, were using 13 different channels. But generally, people have got Slack open, they've got Skype open, they may have WhatsApp open, and they've got pinging messages from email. And each time you get pinged by something, it actually ruins your concentration when you go back. And you tend to take about a minute, very least, to refocus on something. And so if you multiplied how many times you get interrupted in any 1 hour, you lose an awful lot of productivity time. And then there's another thing which I was reading about recently, which is about, I can't remember what the term was, it's called residue deficit or something. So that if you're working something or any long period of time, and then you switch onto something else, it takes you a long time just to sort of refocus and realign. And I think these are all sort of behavioral communication activity things that organizations need to be better understanding. And I think founders, entrepreneurs, those with small businesses have a much better opportunity to put those things in place now than larger organizations. They're going to have to retrofit it.
I think you've touched on a number of things there. One thing that I noticed within our team was something you call, I think it's swallowing the frog, Joe, is that people's focus and priorities, they would, as a team, we communicate on a daily basis, what our top three priorities for the day that we want to try and achieve are. And it was noticeable from me, but also from others, that they were putting off the big ones till last and and you just wouldn't get to it. I know there's another technique. Is it the Pomodoro?
It's the Pomodoro Technique, which is very good. And the Pomodoro Technique is that you organize your time into 25-minute blocks.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that everything can be done in 25 minutes, but you can look it up. You type in Pomodoro Technique, there's some videos on it. But you actually once you start to use it, you get a sense of how long it takes you to do something. So something may only take one Pomodoro, 25 minutes, but something might take 3 Pomodoros. And so you allocate time into those. But what you also do is you actually set the timer on your phone in order to get a sense of how long you're doing something. But if you're like me, I tend to do this and forget that I set the timer, and then I frighten myself as it suddenly goes off. But it does actually work. It does work. And I think it's important that, particularly if at the moment, if you've got children at home and doing things, how you allocate those times in order to have this deep concentration. There's a chap called Cal Newport wrote a book about sort of deep working. And it's the whole idea that going forward in the in sort of, maybe you call it post-digital economy, I don't know, but it's very important that we start to redevelop the skill of deep working and concentrating, because for such a long time with social media and all of these tools, the way that we work and communicate is at a very shallow level. Whereas in fact, if you want to get something done as a business, you need to work at a deep level and actually know how you're going to do it in order to get something done. And I would have thought most people on this call end up saying, well, I'll do this later on night, or I'll do this first thing in the morning, because they're not actually able to do it during the day, which is a bit crazy, which is the time you should be able to do it.
Yes, and the time to unwind.
Yeah.
Joe, I think we're coming up to, or we are at 2:45.
Yeah.
Oh, did you want
to?
Don't
worry about this. This is to do with form. Stu, don't worry about this. We've covered all sorts of things, but thanks. And we might do the final poll, which would be quite good.
Oh, yes.
What is your biggest remote working challenge after 4 weeks? Too many meetings, work-home life balance, finding an uninterrupted 60 minutes, which kind of links to what I was talking about before. Which is yours, Adam?
It's certainly the work-home life balance. especially this week has been particularly challenging, not just for the two work matters, the Future Fund and the furlough portal being open, but schools went back this week, and so this has been the first few days that we've had to adapt to remote learning for the children, and that's had practical and well, all kinds of different challenges with one 6-year-old and one 3-year-old.
Okay. So has the, no, right, I can't vote on this. Has the poll been done? Yeah, work-home life balance. And that goes back to Rachel's point that it's sort of crisis working. I mean, I think what's, yeah, 11% finding the uninterrupted, and then too many meetings. So that kind of backs up, it all backs up what we kind of know, which is always good. I mean, one of the things which I'm working on is this, I did this early when this just started with this chap, Jeremy Blaine, I mentioned at the beginning. We sent out this remote working survey at the very beginning. And we've only had sort of 44 respondents, but it's enough for us to give us a take on things. But we're doing some work on that. We're going to produce a white paper on it in terms of our findings of the feedback people gave us. So what I'll do is, we've got everybody's email. I'll send that white paper out. It's got various recommendations and sometime next week if those would like it.
Okay. All right. Well, Joe, thank you very much for giving up your time and your insights into this topic. And thank you to Stu and Emanuele for handling all the practical sides of this webinar, and to everyone else for joining. I hope you have a lovely weekend and the weather holds, and stay safe, everyone.
Have a very good weekend, everybody. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.